It was a sunny afternoon, the kind of day perfect for a family gathering. The backyard was buzzing with excitement as relatives of all ages came together to celebrate a special occasion. Children ran around, their laughter filling the air, while the adults mingled, sharing stories and catching up. The scent of barbecue wafted through the neighborhood as everyone savored the delicious food prepared with love. Tables were lined with colorful decorations, dishes piled high with family favorites, and cold drinks passed around to keep everyone refreshed. At the center of it all was Grandpa, the heart of the family. His gentle smile and warm presence brought everyone together. He sat in his favorite chair, surrounded by his grandchildren, recounting tales from his younger days. His stories, full of wisdom and humor, were always a hit, and today was no different. Everyone leaned in to listen, laughing at his jokes and marveling at the challenges he had overcome. The family took pride in their strong bond, rooted in respect, love, and traditions passed down through generations. This party was not just a celebration. It was a moment to honor those values. It was the kind of gathering that reminded everyone what truly mattered in life: togetherness, joy, and the strength of family. Neighbors passing by smiled at the scene, charmed by the vibrant atmosphere. Some even paused to exchange pleasantries with the family members near the fence. It was the kind of event that showcased the beauty of a community coming alive, where laughter and music brought people closer. The music wasn't overly loud, just enough to add energy to the occasion. It played a mix of cheerful tunes, some nostalgic favorites that had everyone singing along, and others that got the kids and teens dancing. As the evening approached, the celebration showed no signs of slowing down. The family was deep in their moments of joy, unaware of how things were about to change. What they didn't know was that someone in the neighborhood wasn't happy about the party. A noise complaint had been made, although it wasn't clear why, perhaps envy or simply intolerance. The family, oblivious to the brewing trouble, continued to enjoy their time together, cherishing every moment as if nothing could disturb their happiness. Grandpa, watching the kids play and the adults laugh, felt a deep sense of pride. This was his legacy: a family that stood united, celebrating life's simple pleasures. He leaned back in his chair, his heart full as he thought about how far they had come. Little did he know, the day would soon take an unexpected turn, testing the very strength and unity he had worked so hard to nurture. The family was still enjoying their day, completely immersed in the happiness of their gathering. Kids were running around with popsicles in hand, their faces sticky with sweetness, and the adults had formed small groups, laughing and sharing updates on their lives. The air carried a sense of love and togetherness that felt unbreakable. But outside the warmth of the backyard, 2 police officers were arriving at the street. They stepped out of their patrol car, looking around as if they were expecting trouble. They had been called about a noise complaint, though the sound coming from the party was far from disruptive. It was just the normal hum of laughter, conversations, and music that any celebration might have. The officers walked up to the gate, their expressions stern. One of them glanced at the other, muttering something under his breath, and then banged on the gate loudly, startling a few of the kids nearby. A hush fell over the crowd as people turned to see what was happening. The music stopped, and for a moment, all you could hear was the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. A couple of family members approached the gate, unsure of what the problem was. The older officer spoke first, his tone sharp and unwelcoming. "We've had complaints about noise," he said, looking past them into the yard as though he was searching for something. The family members tried to explain politely that they were simply having a gathering and had made sure not to disturb anyone. They even offered to lower the music further if needed, but the officers didn't seem interested in listening. Instead, the younger officer added, "Looks like you've got a pretty big crowd here. Maybe you should start wrapping this up." The words didn't sit right with anyone. This was their home, their private celebration, and they weren't doing anything wrong. A murmur of confusion and frustration passed through the group as more family members came closer to see what was going on. Some of the kids clung to their parents, unsure why the officers seemed so upset. Grandpa, who had been watching from his chair, decided to step in. He slowly got up, leaning on his cane for support, and walked toward the gate. The crowd parted to let him through, their respect for him clear in the way they stepped aside. Grandpa greeted the officers calmly, his voice steady and kind. "Is there a problem, officers? We're just having a family gathering. We've been mindful of our neighbors." But instead of responding respectfully, the older officer dismissed him with a wave of his hand. "You need to keep it down," he said sharply. The younger officer added, "Or we'll have to take further action." Grandpa didn't back down. He stood tall, his presence commanding attention. "We're not breaking any rules. This is a family gathering, and we've done nothing wrong." The officers exchanged a glance, their frustration evident. The family could feel the tension growing, but no one had expected what would happen next. The family stood still, their eyes on Grandpa as he calmly spoke to the officers. His words carried the wisdom of years, and his tone was steady, showing no fear. Everyone knew Grandpa was not just a man of words, but also a man of dignity. He had always taught them to stand up for what was right, but to do so with respect. The older officer seemed annoyed by Grandpa's presence. He leaned closer and said in a louder voice, "I don't care how polite you're trying to be. If we say there's a problem, there's a problem." His partner stood beside him, arms crossed, scanning the backyard as if trying to find something wrong. Grandpa remained firm. "Officer, with all due respect, we've done nothing to disturb anyone. If there's been a misunderstanding, we're happy to clear it up, but there's no need for this kind of attitude." The family felt a swell of pride hearing Grandpa's words. Even in the face of unnecessary hostility, he refused to let anger take over. But the officers didn't seem to care about the peaceful approach. The older one took a step forward, his voice growing sharper. "Listen, old man, I'm not going to stand here arguing with you. This is your final warning. Shut this party down, or there will be consequences." The air grew heavy as the family watched the exchange, their earlier joy replaced by unease. The kids, sensing the tension, held on to their parents' hands. One of Grandpa's grandsons, a young man who always admired his grandfather's strength, stepped forward. He couldn't hold back anymore. "Why are you treating us like this?" he asked. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a mix of frustration and hurt. The younger officer immediately snapped, "Don't get smart with us, kid. Stay out of this." His harsh tone startled the boy, but before he could respond, Grandpa raised a hand, signaling for him to step back. "It's all right," Grandpa said calmly. "Let me handle this." But the situation was escalating faster than anyone could control. The older officer, seemingly fueled by impatience, reached out and grabbed the edge of the gate. "Enough of this," he muttered, pushing it open to step inside. In the process, he bumped into Grandpa, who stumbled back a little. Gasps filled the air as Grandpa struggled to regain his balance. His cane slipped, and before anyone could react, he fell to the ground. The sight of him lying there sent a wave of shock through the crowd. A few family members rushed to help him up, their voices filled with concern. "Are you okay? Grandpa, can you hear us?" The officers stood frozen for a moment, as if realizing they had crossed a line. But instead of apologizing, the older officer tried to brush it off. "He's fine. Don't make this a big deal." The family, however, wasn't having it. Grandpa's eldest daughter knelt beside him, holding his hand as she glared at the officers. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer emotion of the moment. "How could you do this?" she asked. He wasn't even resisting. The crowd around them grew larger, with neighbors stepping out to see what was happening. Tensions were at an all-time high, and though the officers tried to maintain control, they couldn't ignore the eyes now watching their every move. The scene grew tense as Grandpa lay on the ground, his family rushing to help him up. His granddaughter gently cupped his face in her hands, making sure he was all right, though there was clear concern in her eyes. Grandpa slowly raised his hand, signaling for everyone to calm down. Despite the pain, he tried to smile, reassuring them with a simple, "I'm okay." But the worry in the air was thick, and it was clear to everyone that the situation was far from over. The officers, standing awkwardly by the gate, seemed to sense that things were spiraling out of control. Yet, instead of showing any sign of remorse, the older officer only crossed his arms and muttered under his breath. "We don't have time for this," he said, still trying to appear in charge, though his words lacked the authority they once held. But the family wasn't going to let it slide. Grandpa's daughter stood up, her face flushed with anger. "You didn't even apologize," she said, her voice shaking with disbelief. "He's an elderly man. You pushed him." She was not shouting, but the conviction in her voice left no room for doubt about how wrong the situation was. The officer didn't respond immediately, as if he didn't know what to say. Around them, the rest of the family had gathered, their faces a mix of confusion, concern, and growing anger. Neighbors had begun to step outside, drawn by the commotion. A few of them, who had witnessed the entire scene, were now murmuring among themselves. "This isn't right," one neighbor whispered to another, and others nodded in agreement. But then, something happened that neither the officers nor the family had expected. A voice from the crowd called out, "I've got this on camera." The words hit the officers like a cold breeze. The neighbor who spoke had pulled out their phone and was recording the entire encounter. The officer's face, once set in an expression of authority, suddenly shifted to one of unease. "You're recording this?" The younger officer barked, but it was too late. People around them had begun to pull out their phones as well, capturing every moment. Grandpa's granddaughter turned to the officer with a steady look in her eyes. "We don't need to get loud, but you will answer for what you've done," she said, her tone now calm, but firm. It was at that moment that the officers seemed to realize the gravity of their actions. The older officer, still trying to maintain control, reached for his radio, speaking into it quickly, though his voice no longer carried the same confidence. "We need backup," he said, but there was no bravado in his voice. Instead, he sounded uncertain, as if he was questioning his own authority. The family, though upset, wasn't acting out of anger. Grandpa's granddaughter knelt next to him, still holding his hand. "It's okay, Grandpa," she whispered softly, as though trying to comfort him more than herself. "We'll get through this." Her words were a balm to the wound, and Grandpa, despite the pain, managed another weak smile. The situation was turning from bad to worse for the officers. The family, who had once been joyously celebrating, was now standing united, their eyes filled with a mixture of hurt, disbelief, and determination. The officers, who had hoped to quickly resolve the situation, were now the ones on the defensive. The sound of sirens in the distance signaled the arrival of backup, but the mood had shifted. The officers were no longer in control of the situation, and they knew it. The family had not only witnessed an injustice, but were now determined to make sure it didn't go unnoticed. They weren't going to let what had just happened be swept under the rug. The family's unity, the quiet strength of Grandpa, and the power of community had turned the tide. The officers, who had once held all the power, were now forced to stand back and wait for the inevitable consequences of their actions. The gathering, which had started as a simple celebration, had become a turning point that no one would forget. As the sirens grew louder, the atmosphere grew more charged with tension. The officers stood, clearly uncomfortable, as the family and their neighbors continued to observe the situation unfold. Grandpa, now seated with the help of his granddaughter, looked up at the officers, his face marked with the pain of his fall, but also with a quiet resilience. He didn't say anything, but his presence spoke volumes. The officers, once so full of authority, seemed smaller now, their posture slouched, their voices quieter. A few moments later, the backup arrived, another car pulled up, and a few more officers stepped out. They weren't expecting what they saw. The entire family had gathered in front of the officers, their eyes unwavering. People from neighboring houses had come out too, some just standing silently, others filming on their phones, documenting the whole scene. It was a stark contrast to the officers' expectations of a simple noise complaint being easily squashed. The new officers, clearly taken aback by the large crowd, tried to take control of the situation, but the damage had already been done. The older officer who had been in charge earlier was now speaking in a hushed tone to his backup, clearly trying to explain his side of things. But there was no hiding the fact that the situation had spiraled out of their control. One of the backup officers, a woman who had a calm demeanor, looked over at the family and then at her colleagues. She seemed to understand that something had gone terribly wrong, and the anger in the crowd was not unfounded. Grandpa's granddaughter stood firm, her voice calm, but filled with determination. "You don't get to hurt someone and walk away without facing consequences," she said, looking at the officers with a steady gaze. She wasn't shouting, but her words carried weight. The young officer who had pushed Grandpa earlier shifted his stance, his discomfort evident. He knew there was no denying what had happened. As the new officers spoke among themselves, the family remained close to Grandpa. They were still shaken by the incident, but their resolve was clear. No one was going to let this go unnoticed. One of the neighbors, who had been quietly filming, spoke up. "This isn't right. You can't just push an elderly man and get away with it." The words seemed to stir the crowd, and more neighbors nodded in agreement. They had all seen what had happened, and they weren't about to stay silent. The backup officers, realizing the situation had escalated beyond just a noise complaint, began to take a more serious tone. The calm officer turned to the others and began asking questions about what had transpired before her arrival. She seemed genuinely concerned and was listening to the family's side of the story, which made the officers who had been involved in the incident look even more uncomfortable. They hadn't expected this kind of scrutiny, and it was clear they hadn't handled the situation well. A few moments passed, and the original officers were told to step aside while the new team took control. It was clear that the family's unity had made an impact. The police supervisor, a man who had arrived with the backup team, began speaking to Grandpa's family, apologizing for what had happened and assuring them that the situation would be addressed. It wasn't much, but it was a start. While Grandpa rested with the support of his family, the police chief arrived, having been contacted by one of the mayor's staff members. He came straight to the scene, his face serious, but there was an air of recognition when he saw the family. He immediately turned to the officers who had caused the incident, his expression one of disappointment. It was clear that the officers had not acted in a way that would be tolerated, and the chief knew this was about to become a much bigger issue. For the family, it wasn't about the apology. It was about making sure what had happened didn't fade away into silence. They had witnessed firsthand how quickly things could escalate when someone used their power without respect or accountability. The presence of the neighbors and the evidence that had been recorded meant that this wasn't going to be swept under the rug. Grandpa, though still in pain, had a quiet satisfaction in his eyes. The family's strength and unity had turned the tide. They weren't just victims of an injustice, they were standing up to it, and they were going to make sure their voices were heard. As the scene unfolded, the family stood together, united by the same determination to make sure justice was served. Grandpa, despite the pain from his fall, was holding his ground with the strength that only a life lived with dignity can bring. His children and grandchildren gathered around him, making sure he was okay, but also making sure their voices were heard. The officers were no longer in control. The power had shifted into the hands of the people who had been wronged. The new officers, after listening to the family and neighbors, seemed to realize that the situation was bigger than just a misunderstanding. They spoke quietly among themselves, trying to figure out what to do next. Meanwhile, the original officers who had caused the tension stood off to the side, looking increasingly uncomfortable. It was clear they hadn't expected the situation to blow up like this, and they certainly hadn't expected the community to rally in defense of the family. The family's unity and the support from their neighbors had made an impact. People who had once stayed inside during the commotion now came outside, standing in solidarity with the family. It wasn't just about the noise complaint anymore. It was about the way the officers had treated Grandpa and how quickly the situation had escalated. The neighbors had seen it all and weren't going to pretend they hadn't. Grandpa's daughter, his eldest, was still by his side, holding his hand as she spoke with the officers. She wasn't shouting or angry, but there was a firmness in her voice that made it clear she wouldn't let this go. This isn't about us being upset over a noise complaint. This is about the way you treated an elderly man, my father, who was doing nothing but enjoying time with his family. You can't just walk in and push someone like that. Her words hit hard, and the officers knew it. They had assumed they could intimidate the family into backing down, but they hadn't accounted for the quiet strength of this family or the power of a community that had witnessed an injustice. As the backup officers continued to speak with the family, trying to piece together what had happened, Grandpa's son stepped forward. "You've done enough damage already. We're not leaving this situation without proper answers," he said. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a quiet power that came from knowing he was on the right side of the situation. The police supervisor, who had arrived with the backup team, approached the family with a more respectful tone. He spoke to them about how the department would handle the situation internally, promising that the officers involved would be held accountable for their actions. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. Still, the family knew it wasn't enough. Grandpa's granddaughter, the one who had been filming from the start, kept her phone out, making sure to capture everything. She wasn't trying to make a spectacle of the situation, but she knew the importance of having proof. With everything documented, there was no way the officers could deny the way they had acted. The police chief, who had arrived shortly after the supervisor, walked over to Grandpa and his family. He had heard about what happened, and as soon as he saw the scene, he knew the department had a lot of work to do. He looked at the family with sympathy, but also with a sense of responsibility. "I want to apologize on behalf of the department for the way you've been treated," he said, looking directly at Grandpa. "This should never have happened." Grandpa nodded slowly, still processing what had just occurred. "It's not just the fall, it's the disrespect. We're a family, and we didn't deserve to be treated this way." His voice, though soft, was firm in its message. The chief promised that a full investigation would be launched, and that the officers responsible would face appropriate consequences. He also assured the family that steps would be taken to make sure this kind of situation never happened again. But for the family, the real victory wasn't just in the apology or the promises. It was in standing up, together, and being heard. As the situation began to calm down, the family felt a sense of relief wash over them. Grandpa, though still recovering from his fall, seemed to feel the weight lift. His family had fought for him, for what was right, and they had made a difference. The officers who had tried to intimidate them now understood that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a community standing against mistreatment. And as the crowd slowly began to disperse, the family returned to their gathering. They were tired, shaken, but also proud. What had started as a joyful family celebration had turned into something much bigger. The story would not be forgotten. They had fought for justice, not just for Grandpa, but for the values that held them all together: respect, love, and unity. The evening had started off so differently. What was meant to be a simple family gathering, filled with laughter and warmth, had now turned into a powerful stand against injustice. As the last of the police officers left the scene, the family began to take stock of everything that had happened. The air, which had been filled with tension just moments before, began to calm. But even as the noise from the police cars faded into the distance, the weight of what had occurred still hung in the air. Grandpa, though still feeling the physical strain from the fall, was now sitting comfortably in a chair on the porch. His family had gathered around him, and even though the moment had been stressful, there was a sense of pride in the way they had all come together. They knew they had done the right thing, and that made it easier to breathe. The youngest members of the family, who had been scared and confused by the police presence, now ran around the yard again, their laughter once more filling the air. It was a reminder that despite the hardship, life would go on, and they would keep fighting for what was right. Grandpa's eldest daughter stood nearby, still in conversation with some of the neighbors, who were also offering their support. The whole neighborhood had been affected by what had happened, and many wanted to make sure the family knew they weren't alone. A few of the neighbors who had witnessed the entire scene spoke up, sharing their own thoughts. It was wrong what they did, one neighbor said, shaking their head. But I'm proud of how you handled it. You didn't back down. You made sure the truth was seen. Another neighbor added, it's not just about one incident. It's about what happens when we let things slide. You showed us how to stand up for what's right. These words weren't just comforting. They were empowering. The family realized that what had happened wasn't just an isolated event, but a moment that could spark change. It was a reminder that standing up for justice didn't just benefit one person. It affected everyone in the community. As the evening drew on, the food that had once been served on the grill was now shared amongst the group, though it was clear that the mood had shifted. The laughter was quieter, but still genuine. The family was still together, still strong, and still determined to make sure their voices were heard. Grandpa, despite everything, remained the center of attention. His grandchildren gathered around him, eager to hear his thoughts on what had happened. He smiled warmly at them, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. Sometimes in life, people forget what it means to show respect, he said softly. But when we stand together, when we support each other, we can make sure that respect is never lost. His words hung in the air, and for a moment, the family was silent. Grandpa's voice, calm and full of wisdom, reminded them all of the strength they had inside. This wasn't just about what had happened with the police. It was about teaching the younger generation how to stand up for what was right, even when the world around them seemed unjust. As the night continued, the family began to pack up, but there was an air of determination in their movements. No one was leaving without knowing that they had made a difference. They had stood their ground and had done so with dignity. They weren't just a family, they were a community that refused to let fear or injustice control them. The officers who had caused the incident were still in the back of their minds, but the family knew they had done what they could. They had ensured that what happened was seen by others, that it would be remembered. It wasn't just about standing up to the officers. It was about standing up to the system that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. And that meant something. As the night ended, Grandpa's family looked out over the yard. The lights were dimming, but there was a warmth in the air, the kind that only comes from knowing you've done what's right. The world might be full of challenges, but together, they would face whatever came next, stronger and more united than ever before. The following days were filled with a mix of emotions for the family. While the situation with the police had left them shaken, they found strength in the support they received from friends, neighbors, and even strangers. The story of what had happened spread quickly through the neighborhood, and many people reached out to express their anger and support for the family. The community rallied behind them, offering comfort and speaking out against the injustice. In the days after the incident, Grandpa's family began to feel a renewed sense of purpose. They knew that what had happened wasn't just about one officer or one bad situation. It was part of a bigger issue, one that needed to be addressed. The family decided they would not let the incident fade away. They would use their voices to make sure it was heard, not only for themselves, but for everyone who had ever faced similar mistreatment. Grandpa's daughter took the lead in reaching out to local organizations that advocated for civil rights and community justice. She felt strongly that this situation wasn't just a personal issue. It was something that affected everyone in the community, especially those who didn't always have the power or resources to stand up for themselves. She spoke with several groups, sharing their story and asking for guidance on what steps they could take next. The support they received from these organizations was overwhelming. They were given advice on how to document the incident, the legal rights of citizens in situations like this, and ways to keep the momentum going. The family learned that they could take the story to the local news, speak at town meetings, and even work with legal teams who could help hold the officers accountable for their actions. They were reminded that their voices, when used together, could make a real difference. Meanwhile, Grandpa's grandchildren, who had been so scared during the incident, began to understand the importance of standing up for others. They had seen firsthand how their family had responded to injustice, and they were inspired to follow in their footsteps. The younger ones, in particular, started asking questions about their rights and how they could help make sure something like this never happened again. It was a powerful moment, one where the next generation was learning not just about the world they lived in, but about how they could help change it. In the days that followed, the family continued to gather together, not just to heal, but to plan. They didn't want to be reactive. They wanted to be proactive. They knew that in order to prevent something like this from happening again, they needed to ensure that the officers involved were held accountable and that their story was shared with the wider community. As the family began to take action, they also felt a sense of pride in how far they had come. They had started as just a group of people trying to have a good time together, but now they were something more. They were a voice for change. They weren't alone in their fight. Others in the community had begun to join them. People who had witnessed the events and had seen the injustice began speaking out too. It was clear that the officers who had caused the disruption were no longer just dealing with an isolated incident. They were facing a growing movement of people who were unwilling to accept what had happened. The family's unity became a symbol of strength, not just for their neighborhood, but for the wider community. They had turned a difficult and painful experience into something powerful, a force for change. They knew that there was still a long road ahead of them, but they were prepared to walk it together, side by side. In the weeks that followed, the family spoke out at town hall meetings, telling their story to anyone who would listen. They made sure the news of what happened didn't disappear. They used their voices to ask for accountability, for change, and for a system that would treat everyone with respect, no matter who they were or where they came from. Grandpa, who had been the target of the officers' unjust treatment, found peace in knowing that his family was fighting for something bigger than just his own rights. He was proud of his children and grandchildren, not just for standing by him in the moment, but for taking action to make sure no one else would ever have to experience the same thing. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, the family knew that they had already made a difference. They had shown that, together, they were stronger than any force that tried to tear them apart. As time passed, the family's efforts continued to make waves. They had begun a conversation that wasn't easy, but it was necessary. What had started as a single, upsetting incident had grown into something much larger, a movement for change. More and more people in the community began to speak out about the treatment they had seen, and the officers involved were not forgotten. The neighborhood rallied around the family, and the local news picked up the story, giving it the attention it deserved. In the weeks that followed, the police department launched an internal investigation. The officers who had been involved in the incident were put under scrutiny, and the department issued an official statement acknowledging the family's concerns. Though it was a small step, it was a step toward accountability. The family knew that this wasn't just about what happened to Grandpa anymore. It was about making sure that the system would change, so no one else would have to face the same treatment. One day, a representative from the police department came to the family's home to apologize in person. It wasn't the kind of apology they had expected, but it was an important moment. The officer who had come to speak to them admitted that the situation had been mishandled and that the family deserved better. While the apology wasn't enough to undo what had happened, it was a sign that things were beginning to shift. The family understood that change took time, but this was a start. Grandpa, in his quiet way, accepted the apology. He wasn't one for holding grudges, but he made it clear that this moment wasn't just about forgiveness, it was about learning from mistakes. "We can't erase what happened," he said, "but we can make sure it doesn't happen again. That's what matters." The family's story continued to inspire others. They received messages from people who had experienced similar situations, sharing their own stories of mistreatment and how the family's bravery had given them the courage to speak up. The family realized that they weren't alone in this fight. They had sparked something bigger than themselves, and their efforts were helping to change attitudes in their community. The younger members of the family, who had witnessed everything unfold, took these lessons to heart. They began to think more critically about the world around them and how they could help make it a better place. They participated in local events focused on justice and equality, using their voices to raise awareness. What had started as a painful experience had turned into a lesson for the whole family, especially the younger generation, who were now more aware of their power to influence change. Over time, the community saw improvements. The local police department introduced new training programs aimed at improving relations between officers and the public. The family felt proud that their story had played a part in pushing for those changes. They knew that real change wasn't easy or immediate, but they had taken the first step. They had helped shift the narrative, and that was something to be proud of. Grandpa, though still carrying the memory of what happened, was at peace. He had seen his family stand up for what was right, and he knew that they had made a difference. As he sat in his favorite chair, surrounded by loved ones, he couldn't help but smile. His family had turned a dark moment into something powerful, and in doing so, they had not only stood up for him, but for their entire community. The family gathered again, not for a celebration, but for a quiet moment of reflection. They had been through a lot, but together, they had shown strength, resilience, and unity. They knew that their fight was far from over, but they had already proven that when they stood together, they could face any challenge. What happened that night would always be a part of their story, but it was no longer just about what they had suffered. It was about what they had achieved. They had raised their voices, demanded justice, and inspired others to do the same. Their journey had just begun, and they were ready to continue fighting for a world where respect, fairness, and justice were the norms, not the exceptions.